Russia will do things to make life unpleasant in the Baltic states. That's happening already with drones flying into airspace of Lithuania, other countries, various kinds of political pressure. There are ethnic Russians, Russian speakers in Latvia and Estonia, and Russia will use that as a kind of wedge issue to divide the politics of these countries. But I don't think that there's a strategic argument. Now, of course, you could say the same about Ukraine in 2022. What was Russia's real strategic argument there? It was more maybe the madness of Putin that's behind this war. And so you do have to factor that in, and that could be relevant to the Baltic states. But I think it's more abstract than that the Russia challenge, if the war were to come to an end in Ukraine, I think Russia would look for ways to exert pressure on Europe as a whole. Because after all, the big game for Russia, what's really important is Europe, not the Baltic republics, which are, 6 billion people total population. It's a small part of Europe. What matters is Germany, France, and the UK, and how Russia could pursue its regional ambitions vis-a-vis those countries. And maybe military force plays a role, or some kind of nuclear blackmail, or instigating a crisis with those countries. But I would focus my attention on the big countries of Western Europe, because Russia doesn't solve its problems such as they create these problems. Russia doesn't solve them through the Baltics. They solve them through the transatlantic relationship, or they solve them through the big countries of Western Europe.
Hello and welcome to the 24 War and Politics YouTube channel. Today we will discuss when Putin may be willing to end the war, what steps he could take as he finds himself increasingly cornered, and what a potential respite in the Russia-Ukraine war might look like. Our guest today is Michael Kimmage, professor of history and writer. Michael, it's great to see you.
Great to be with you, Maxim.
Foreign Minister of Russia Sergei Lavrov recently stated that it will not be diplomats who decide the outcome, but the situation on the battlefield. Yet what we see on the battlefield is hardly favorable to Russia. At this point, Moscow's primary capability appears to be the terrorization of civilians through massive missile and drone attacks. So I would like to ask you, what exactly is Russia hoping to achieve in current period of the war?
Well, it's hard to work off of very solid evidence in this case. We have to simply guess what Putin's calculus is. I wouldn't judge too much from the speeches or the statements of figures like Foreign Minister Lavrov as to Russia's true intentions with this conflict. The best that I can do in terms of trying to understand Russia's perspective is to assume that for Putin, it's very, very difficult to change course, because his vanity and ego play an enormous role in this conflict, because he's made this conflict the event of his presidency. Putin's presidency will be judged in the future as to how he performs, what he accomplishes or doesn't accomplish with this war for Russia. And so I find it very hard to imagine in the next 6 to 12 months that Putin would truly change course. And so going with, I think, the most probable set of Russian intentions, it's to just keep going as Russia is doing at the moment, as you mentioned, Maxim, a brutal war against the civilians of Ukraine, because the battlefield is not moving much on the front lines in terms of territory. But then I think Russia is betting on the winter, that it will continue its attacks on civilian infrastructure in Ukraine, and that it will be a difficult winter for Ukraine, and that some advantage might emerge. I don't think that this is really a strategy on the Russian part. It's sort of more a kind of set of hopes that Russia has, sort of desperate hopes that something will crack in Ukraine politically, that Europe will, lose its willingness to support Ukraine because of elections that could take place in Britain or France or elsewhere, or that some initiative will come from the Trump White House, which will make it very difficult for Ukraine to continue the war. I don't think that these are realistic hopes on the Russian side. I think it's, again, a kind of sign of desperation, but I think at the moment Russia is betting on the winter. I don't think that Russia is looking for an exit yet from this war. I wish I could say that. It's something that I would like to see, but I just don't believe in that for the short to medium term.
And when it comes to the current period of war, we see that both sides can play this game. I mean that Ukraine continues to conduct successful strikes against Russia's oil refining infrastructure. Okay. We are already seeing the consequences in the form of fuel shortages, logistical disruptions, and increasing pressure on occupied Crimea and Moscow. However, the question remains, when will these developments become truly critical for Russia, and could they eventually alter the course of the war? And if so, how?
No, I think absolutely they can, and I think they probably are altering the course of the war. What you mentioned, Ukraine's growing capacity, uh, first of all, to limit Russian advances, which is not the conversation we were having 2 years ago. But for the last 2 years, Ukraine has really stabilized the front line with, a few small qualifications or changes to that point that you could make. And exactly as you've mentioned, Maxim, Ukraine has a growing capacity uh, to use its military force within Russia. And, the strategy of Ukraine at the moment seems to be to address the underpinnings of Russian power, both economic and military, oil refineries and Russia's productive capacity. And that's not a static situation. That's a situation in which Ukraine's capacity is increasing. I don't think that Russian public opinion matters a great deal. I think Russian public opinion is probably shifting against the war. I don't think it's ever been a war that's been strongly supported by Russian public opinion. But of course, Russia is not a democracy, and there are no real elections in Russia. And so public opinion is a very limited factor. What you have seen in the last 2 months, particularly, is that Russian elite opinion is publicly shifting. This is not a revolutionary change that people are coming out against Putin. I think the critics of the war are emerging from the silence that they've maintained for the first 4 years of the war, that you do see more criticism of the war, not yet criticism of Putin. And that's an important distinction. That's an important point. It's not as if Russian elites are coming out against the regime in Russia or against the leader, but they are becoming increasingly critical of the war. A rational conversation in Russia, which is not the conversation I think that's going on in the Kremlin, but a rational conversation would suggest that Russia has run out of options in this war. And that Russia cannot win the war, and that therefore you need to start thinking about alternative solutions to the challenge that Russia faces of what it's going to do with this terrible war that it's begun. I think that the Russian elite recognizes that, and certainly behind closed doors and in private is probably having a very detailed analytical conversation about that Russian dilemma. But to bring that to the Kremlin at the moment is still extremely difficult. My working assumption, Maxim, is that Putin gets very upbeat reports, positive reports about how the war is going, and also very positive and probably unrealistic reports about public opinion and politics in the United States and Europe, as if the United States and Europe are about to abandon Ukraine, which is not the case. But unfortunately, that means if Putin is getting this information, that for him to change his mind, very, very difficult to imagine. But the growing pressure from Russian political elites matters. And 6 months from now, it might matter a lot more than it does at the present moment.
When it comes to the Western support to Ukraine, do you believe that following agreement between the United States and Iran, Washington's strategic focus could shift back toward Ukraine? If so, what would such a shift look like in practical terms?
Yeah, that's a very important question. That's a very good question. President Trump at the moment, it's not an easy question to gauge in this respect, but President Trump at the moment is a weakened American president. He has just lost a war against Iran. I think that that's the right way to put it, although Trump, of course, will claim it's a success and a victory. That's going to have lots of problems, going to create lots of problems for Trump within the Republican Party, which has been very hawkish on Iran for a long time. With public opinion in the United States, Trump is quite unpopular, and he has to also wrestle with high energy costs for just the general American consumer. And so Trump is not the powerful president that he was a year ago. But even when Trump was a powerful president, he was not able to achieve anything with the negotiations on the war in Ukraine. He doesn't achieve any kind of change in Ukraine, although he did put a lot of pressure on Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. And Trump didn't achieve any kind of change with Russia. He didn't encourage real negotiations with Russia. Russia didn't change its position on the war. So I suspect that, yes, Trump may turn his attention now to Europe after the great defeat that he suffered in the Middle East. He does so as a weakened president. I still don't think he has an agenda for the war in ways that Trump probably doesn't see. Ukraine is gaining in agency and gaining in strength. And the European commitment to Ukraine is a commitment for the long term. Here, I think Germany is the key actor, and the United States has no ability to change that. So I don't think that the United States is such an important factor at this stage in the war. The intelligence sharing and targeting matters that the U.S. provides to the Ukrainian military. That might even increase a little bit under Trump. That's not impossible. But on the negotiating side, the United States has no real ideas, no process for getting those ideas across. And Trump's internal political weakness is going to matter because in Kyiv and in Moscow, people are going to see that Trump is just not, the strong man that he says he is. And that, of course, matters on the international stage.
Okay, we have already discussed that Putin now finds himself facing a number of mounting challenges. I mean, potentially reduced oil revenues following a US-Iran agreement, a military that appears unable to achieve a decisive breakthrough on the battlefield, commitments from Ukraine's allies to strengthen air defenses and increase pressure on Moscow, and successful Ukrainian drone attacks against Russia's oil refining sector. But if the pressure on Putin continues to intensify, what radical options might he realistically consider under such circumstances?
Sure. I think that's the key question to ask because, and I say this with great regret, I wish that Putin would just end the war immediately and for Russia's sake and for Ukraine's sake, put this all into the past tense. But we have to address the Putin who's really there in the Kremlin, and this is a man who's ruthless and is simply not going to give up in terms of the ambitions that he's given himself in Ukraine. So therefore, the question about escalatory options is quite important. And I think here, too, Putin is somewhat trapped. He does not have real military escalatory options because he's already indulged these options over the last couple of years. He's been waging a war, as you've mentioned, Maxim, against Ukrainian civilians since the start of the conflict. So he can't escalate in that direction. He's already attacked Ukraine's ability to provide electricity and heating, the basics of civilian life. I would assume that he's going to continue doing that. I mean, I think that there are some questions to ask about just, very basic civilian infrastructure in places like, Lviv and Kyiv and Kharkiv and elsewhere, sort of sewage treatment and just how cities function. And it may be that Russia has escalatory options there that it hasn't yet pursued. And so on the practical side, I think it's important to explore those options and for Ukraine and its partners and allies to prepare for that, as I'm sure is happening already. But I don't think that the nuclear option works for Trump, for Putin in Ukraine. That is, of course, an escalatory option that Russia has in theory, but I don't think it wins the war for Russia. And I think very likely it loses Russia's support from countries like India and China that would be horrified by the use of nuclear weapons in Ukraine. And so maybe finally what Russia has are escalatory options, not so much in Ukraine, where Russia has been waging a maximalist war, but Russia has escalatory options in Europe. So Russia could try to raise the costs. We saw that there's reports from the BBC about arson attacks on Keir Starmer's car and Keir Starmer's home. There have been lots of sabotage efforts on the part of Russian intelligence in Europe that might really increase, or Russia might even begin to pursue conventional military strikes and attacks on European territory as a way of breaking apart the relationship between Europe and Ukraine. So I think in the end the escalatory options in Ukraine are very small, but Russia does have some escalatory options elsewhere, and these are all options that we should be discussing carefully in detail because Putin shows every sign of being able to go in that direction.
How do you consider one more escalatory option for Putin as general mobilization?
I don't know. I think Putin is still a politician and still has to function as a politician in Russia and not as just the complete tyrant who can get Russians to do anything. And in that sense, I think Putin recognizes that the war has exhausted Russia, that he's never really properly explained how a special military operation or special, sort of technical operation has grown into a major war, for which Russians are beginning to pay a real economic price and also a price in psychological security. When people see in Russia, I think, Ukrainian attacks on oil refineries, it feels like it's very close to home. And I think Putin has not done a good job of preparing the Russian population for that reality. And we've seen that Russia has been able to mobilize and kind of meet its conscription demands through money so far, especially in the poorer parts of Russia, where the money that's being offered is significant. But that's very different from a war. You could think back to the Second World War, where mobilization was effortless because people felt that the homeland was really under attack. That's not the situation. Russia is the aggressor in this war. The war was supposed to be far away. That was one of the political promises that Putin made to the Russian people at the beginning of the war. That's no longer true. And at the same time, I don't think that the capacity to mobilize on a sincere basis is there. And so it would have to be a very coercive mobilization. You'd have to use the police and the repressive apparatus of the state, which is there in Russia, to mobilize people. But that could be the end of the Putin regime. That could be the moment when things really crack and Russians begin to resist. And here you want to look at the history of other countries. Since I'm, from the United States, the Vietnam War fails for the United States when, in a way, mobilization or conscription goes too far. They crossed a political threshold, and the war really began to fail. Russia's a different country. It's a dictatorship, and that means that the rules are different, but not entirely different. So I think mobilization on a mass scale is a very, very hard option for Putin.
Anyway, Michael, I would like to ask you, what could a realistic respite or pause in the war look like? Because we understand that this war can't be endless, and any kind of respite or pause, I think, is inevitable.
Well, I think that the option, unfortunately, that's not there in the short to medium term, and this is a story of Putin's Russia, is that Ukraine is not going to have a comfortable peace in the short to medium term because of Putin's character and because of the way he looks at the region, and also because of the way Putin would react to defeat in Ukraine, which I think would be very, very difficult for him to tolerate. So I don't think a kind of clear-cut negotiation where the war simply ends, perhaps some kind of territorial agreement or set of agreements about Ukraine's place in Europe and the kind of configurations of the border between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, you could, in theory, imagine negotiations that would find a point that's mutually acceptable to Ukraine and to Russia, and the war could end. But I don't think that that's the path, which I say with great regret, because I think it means that the war is, in one form or another, going to be with us for a long time to come. But let me give you a different answer to the question, Maxim, about a scenario that's not the complete end of the war, but a partial end to the war. And this, I think, follows from Ukraine's ability to really raise costs for Russia within Russia itself. And this will be practical piecemeal negotiations between Ukraine and Russia, not between the White House and the Kremlin, but between Ukraine and Russia, where, because Russia does not want to have Ukrainian strikes on oil refineries, will offer to withdraw certain Russian capacities to make strikes on Ukraine as a kind of symmetrical back and forth process, where the war is made smaller and where agreements can be made on particular issues. And this is actually a kind of negotiation that's been going on between Ukraine and Russia since the start of the war. There have been prisoner exchanges. There was, I think, a moment when there was a discussion about electrical grids in both countries and that there could be an agreement not to make strikes on electrical grids. That hasn't worked so far, but that, I think, is the model going forward, that Ukraine has a lot of leverage now. It has a lot of agency. It has a superb military that is a genuine challenge for Russia under any circumstances. And I think Russia might negotiate bits and pieces of an agreement that makes this a smaller war rather than a bigger war. And I don't think that that's a terrible outcome for Ukraine. I think that Ukraine can start to dictate the size of the war and hopefully just make it smaller and smaller and smaller over time. But I don't think that we're going to get rid of the Russia challenge or the Russia threat through negotiation, or at least not in the next year or two.
Yeah, we are hearing, anyway, we are hearing increasing discussion about a possible diplomatic settlement to the Russia-Ukraine war, yet Russia's leadership from Putin to Lavrov and Peskov, etc., continues to insist that Moscow has no intention of stopping. But at the same time, Ukraine's recent successes on the battlefield strengthened the belief that it may eventually be able to reclaim more of its occupied territory. Doesn't it seem that while the West speaks about a window of opportunity for peace, neither Russia nor Ukraine currently appears ready to end the war?
Yeah, I think that that's true. I don't want to speak on behalf of Ukraine in this regard because I'm not a Ukrainian citizen. I'll just offer a thought here that I don't think on the Ukrainian side that the primary issue is territory. I'm sure that in the future Ukraine could live with some of its territory under Russian occupation, not happily and with a long-term plan of restoring the full territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, to be sure. And I think that those territorial issues, are probably somewhat similar on the Russian side, that Russia can live with a lot of different configurations. And I don't even know at this point what the territory that Russia occupies in Ukraine, what is it worth, right? Who's going on vacation at this point in Crimea? Who would want to live in a place like Mariupol or some of the territories that Russia occupies. It's of no economic value to Russia. It's not a desirable
Hmm.
place to be. So I don't think that the territory is the issue, and probably there are arrangements that could be worked out. But I do think on a strategic level for Ukraine, it's a large structural challenge that Russia is not going to give up on its regional ambitions. So Russia might make an agreement next month about territory, ceasefire, line of contact, and all of that, but that's not an end to the war for Ukraine. So an end to the war for Ukraine comes, I think, with what's happening with this building relationship with Europe, with increasing technological capacity, sophisticated defense industrial production. Maybe an American president after Trump will be a part of this arrangement from the U.S. side, but the U.S. is currently not especially helpful in this respect. But sort of building a defensive capacity that Russia cannot overcome. And maybe that's not even a matter of negotiation, right? That just Ukraine is a fortress itself. It's a kind of impregnable fortress, and Russia can go no further. But I don't think negotiations and discussions of territory at this stage will move the conflict to an end. And I don't think that Ukraine can remove Putin from power in Russia. And Russia, of course, remains a nuclear power that nobody can just erase from the map. And so that challenge is built in. It's more the long-term structural changes that are affecting this war than any kind of negotiated solution. But wars change rapidly, and some of the pressures that are exerting themselves in Russia, economic and political, might change the calculus on the Russian side. Maybe they'll move Putin halfway toward some kind of really meaningful compromise. But at the moment, I think it's really a question of defense industrial capacity for Europe and Ukraine. And the trend lines are good, but it's a matter of sticking with those and having the patience to maintain all of that.
When it comes to our defense capacity, we see that one of Russia's remaining strategic advantages is its arsenal of ballistic missiles, which Moscow continues to use to terrorize Ukrainian cities. Ukraine still lacks sufficient interceptor missiles, while its allies have not provided enough air defense systems and ammunition to fully address the threat. President Zelensky has repeatedly proposed that the United States grant Ukraine a license to manufacture such interceptors domestically, but so far he has not received a positive response. Do you think there are concerns in Washington that by acquiring these technologies, Ukraine could become more independent from its allies, which may not necessarily align with US interests?
Yeah, I doubt that this is very carefully thought through in Washington. One of the issues with the interceptors is, of course, the war in Iran, which is now over, it seems. But the U.S. has expended a lot of interceptors there, and of course, the U.S. and Israel have their own relationship when it comes to interceptors and air defense and all of that, and that plays a role on the supply side. It's very hard to figure out the Trump administration position on Ukraine because it's not constant and it's not linear, and there's domestic politics there. But I think that the theory that the Trump administration had at the beginning of its second term, so January 2025 and thereafter, was that the U.S. was going to be in between when it came to the conflict. Very much unlike the Biden administration, which saw itself on the side of Ukraine and on the side of Europe, the Trump administration thought that it was going to be in between. And by signaling to Russia that the United States was now in between, kind of neutral when it came to the conflict, that they could accelerate an end to the war. I think that was their theory. I think they probably still on some level believe that theory. And so I think the reason that they probably don't want to give Ukraine any kind of military advantage is because what the Trump administration wants more than anything else is a quick end to the war. And they think a quick end to the war is going to come when, sort of Russia sees that it's gone as far as it can go and that it can have a relationship of respect with the United States and that something can be worked out. I find all of this very unrealistic on Washington's side and also kind of incoherent. But I think that Ukraine for them is a symbol of a country that got too much from the Biden administration and that you can somehow resolve the war by giving Ukraine less. Now, I don't endorse the logic of that. It's not my interpretation of the war or of the situation, but I think that's what's at work with Trump. I don't think Trump is a friend of Ukraine. I don't think he's fond of the country. I don't think it's an easy relationship that he has with President Zelensky. That's personal, maybe to a degree. That's domestic politics also in the United States, the kind of MAGA movement and where it sees Europe and Ukraine. And these are emotional, sort of symbolic issues that also play a role, but they're important to remember. Those are not strategic positions, but those are kind of the emotions of politics, and they're meaningful.
We have already discussed Putin's escalatory option to use any kind of escalation in European countries. But I would like to look at this issue from different angle, I would say. Many experts argue that the only factor preventing Russia from attacking the Baltic states is the fact that Moscow remains deeply bogged down in Ukraine and is devoting the bulk of its resources to this war in Ukraine. How realistic do you consider the scenario in which, following a ceasefire or any peace agreement in Ukraine, Russia takes more radical steps in confrontation against NATO's eastern flank?
I'm not so convinced. What I can't see in this scenario is what Russia gains from that. Russia has Kaliningrad, it has a port on the Baltic Sea, has St. Petersburg as well. Economically, there's no gain from a war against the Baltic republics. Yes, ideologically, you've seen statements from Foreign Minister Lavrov and Putin in the past that are very aggressive toward the Baltic states. They were, of course, a part of the Soviet Union, and before that of the Russian Empire, so there's some history there. But I'm skeptical. I think, yes, Russia will do things to make life unpleasant in the Baltic states. That's happening already with drones flying into airspace of Lithuania, other countries, various kinds of political pressure. There are ethnic Russians, Russian speakers in Latvia and Estonia, and Russia will use that as a kind of wedge issue to divide the politics of these countries. But I don't think that there's a strategic argument. Now, of course, you could say the same about Ukraine in 2022. What was Russia's real strategic argument there? It was more maybe the madness of Putin that's behind this war. And so you do have to factor that in, and that could be relevant to the Baltic states. But I think it's more abstract than that the Russia challenge, if the war were to come to an end in Ukraine, I think Russia would look for ways to exert pressure on Europe as a whole. Because after all, the big game for Russia, what's really important is Europe, not the Baltic republics, which are, 6 billion people total population. It's a small part of Europe. What matters is Germany, France, and the UK, and how Russia could pursue its regional ambitions vis-a-vis those countries. And maybe military force plays a role, or some kind of nuclear blackmail, or instigating a crisis with those countries. But I would focus my attention on the big countries of Western Europe, because Russia doesn't solve its problems such as they create these problems. Russia doesn't solve them through the Baltics. They solve them through the transatlantic relationship, or they solve them through the big countries of Western Europe. So it's not that I would want to be too casual or sort of too hopeful about the ultimate security of the Baltics. It's a hard question, but I don't think it's at the center of things.
Michael, thank you very much for your expertise and for your time. It's a pleasure to talk to you. Have a good day.
Likewise. Thank you, Maxim, for the invitation. I hope we can speak again.
Yeah, I hope so. Thank you very much. And Michael, I will send you the link to our interview after publication.
Yeah, great. I really appreciate it. Such a pleasure, Maxim. Thank you for the wonderful questions.
Yeah, appreciate it. Thank you. Goodbye. Goodbye, Michael.
Bye-bye.